Hello, BookTube, and this is a bit of an addendum or an extra for the Future History Project, or I could call it iRobot Revisited. And I will be discussing the specific book, iRobot, and the rest of the robots. iRobot was put together of short stories in 1950, and it was published by Gnome Press. And he did what it was like. It was almost like a fix-up novel because there are editorial bits put in there, not as Isaac Asimov as the author. It was a journalist that was interviewing and speaking to Susan Calvin in 2064, just before she died. And he starts out talking with her, and uh, we learn. This is the first time we learn things about. I think I've dealt with the introduction a little bit, but not with the other material. And it starts out that she was born in 1982, and well, it says it makes her 75 now. Okay, so this is when he's speaking to her when she was 75. And she goes on to saying she obtained her bachelor's degree at Columbia in 2003 and began graduate work in cybernetics. And in 2008, she received her PhD, and she started working for United States robots and mechanical men as a robo psychologist. And it was new science as it was talking here. Lawrence Robertson was president of the corporation. He was the founder. And Alfred Lanning been director of research. And for 50 years, at this point, she oversaw a lot of things. And she talks a little bit about Robbie, and that's the introduction for the first story, Robbie. And at the end of each story, there's extra material as well that's put in by this fictitious editor, or the journalist, the interviewer. And at the end of Robbie, she was saying that, like the last line in Robbie is, "Well," said Mrs. Weston, at last, "I guess he can stay with us until he rusts." And she says, "Well, of course he didn't. That was in 1998. By 2002, they invented the mobile speaking robot, which, of course, made all the non-speaking robots out of date, and which seemed to be the final straw as far as non-robot elements were concerned. Most of the world governments banned robot use on Earth for any purpose other than scientific research between 2003 and 2007. And then she's saying so that Gloria had to give up Robbie eventually. And she said he did. And then she talks about that she actually saw her when she was 15, and that's in the story. And then we go to runaround. Sorry. I'm not sure if there's anything in runaround at the end. Let's see here. Yeah, there is a little bit. Yeah. Oh no, actually no, there isn't. There's nothing for that, and there's a little bit about Powell and Donovan, and them being troubleshooters. Oh, sorry. Allergies have been really bad. Sort of trying to stifle sneezes all the time. Um, and it goes on like there's little bits in every one. Uh, and the one of the most interesting parts here is for the Byerly, the robot sort of coordinator, mayor, and so forth, or potential robot. That's the evidence. Uh, and and she talks about meeting him the first time, um, and she says some interesting stuff here. She says that he had died the previous year, or was decided to die, and he was atomized, so there was no proof whether he was a robot or not a robot. The question still remained. And then the very last is the inevitable conflict in here, and it's a very good line at the or well, the little editorial bit at the end here. And that is all, said Dr. Calvin, rising. I saw it from the beginning, when the poor robots couldn't speak, to the end, when they stand between mankind and destruction. I will see no more. My life is over. You will see what comes next. I never saw Susan Calvin again. She died last month at the age of 82. So that makes 2064 that she was 82. And that's one of Asimov's sort of things. She was born in 82, so she lives to 80 to the age of 82. But there's also, well, maybe it's, no, it is in here. When she's talking about Powell and Donovan, she talks about, and she connects the other stuff too, that when they got the hyperspace drive, they started colonizing. So by 2030s, or even before, there were some colonies on other planets. She doesn't name them, but clearly it would be Aurora, because that was the first planet to be populated, which then Daniel and everything flows from that. Now, rest of the robots. Gnome Press, the iRobot went out of print in Gnome Press, and Doubleday picked it up early 70s, maybe 63, early 60s. They reprinted it, and then in 64 they put out the rest of the robots, which is again another collection. But instead of a fictitious editorial, he goes back to his normal. Every time he put out that he collected together short stories, when he had enough short stories to do a collection, he would put in little editorial bits, usually autobiographical or things that were happening at the time. Well, that's autobiographical, but little bits about the writing of it, where it was placed, and if there was any rewrites or problems getting it done, or who asked him to write it, if it was, or it just came from him. And for the rest of the robots, he's got a 6-page introduction, and he starts out with basically telling a story of a very famous male writer whose wife says, I want to write a book. And he sort of says, yes, dear, go ahead, dear. And she writes a book, and it becomes more famous than anything he ever wrote. And so that's his introduction to Frankenstein, Mary Shelley. And talking about how the creature that she created destroyed its creator, Frankenstein, and everything he loved. And he calls it the Frankenstein complex, and he calls it's Faustian as well, because it's sort of, delving into things, blaspheming, things that thou shalt not do, that kind of thing, and delving into things that they shouldn't do. And then he rolls ahead very quickly to the 20th century, and in 1921, Carl Capek wrote RUR, Rossum's Universal Robots, and that was Asimov was 1 year old at that time when that was written, and it was translated into English in 1923, so therefore he was 3 years old. But again, it's this evil scientist sort of, and the robots, and that's where you get the first time use of robots for a creation for the scientist, and they do again destroy their creator. And this sort of led this was a lot of robot stories in the 20s and in the 30s, not all but a lot of them. So he wanted to get away from that when he wrote stories, and he says in here that he thought, well, these aren't blasphemers, these are engineers that are creating this, so let's throw that out to begin with. And that if you got an implement, like if you got a knife, there's a hilt on it to protect your hand. We got stairs, you got banisters to protect, and he just goes on a few other things of inventions that have safety measures built in. So why wouldn't robots have safety features built in? Hence the development of the three laws of robotics. And he talks about that he's been told that he will be remembered for this, and he doesn't really. He writes that he doesn't really like it. He thinks of himself as a scientist first and foremost, but he supposes that if they ever do create a robot, like it's a fake science that he's created, the robots, but he wanted to be remembered as a real scientist. But Isaac, you didn't really do original research that much. You wrote. Anyway, but he says, in the future, if they do create robots like he describes, then they might very well use a variation or something like the three laws of robotics. So he says, then they would be posthumously sort of awarded to him, and he's fine with that. So yeah, so in each story, again, there's introductions, and there's a little introduction to Victory Unintentional. The first story in here is Robot AL-26 Goes Astray, and he talks about it being a humorous story. And then he says Victory Unintentional is the next example is less blatantly humorous. Really? I thought it was very humorous. Anyway, he just talks about the way it was written, and that there was a precursor story to it for that. And then he's got the next section is laws of robotics, and so he does go through of sort of sorry, I thought I had the date for the reprint of it is, 1963, when Doubleday did the reprint for iRobot, and then 64 for this one. But he just talks about all the robot stories, and he goes back and says, like in the Iliad, there's Hephaestus makes some what he calls robots. So he's saying there's a tradition throughout for robots, and he's got another Powell and Donovan, or a Donovan story, the first law, which is tall tale basically, and I'm just trying to see here which other ones that were sort of interest. And he talks about how he loves Susan Calvin, and he wrote more stories about Susan Calvin, and he said he fell in love with Dr. Calvin. She was a forbidding creature, to be sure, much more like the popular conception of a robot than were any of my positronic creations, but I loved her anyway. She served as the central bond that knit together the stories of iRobot, and in 4 of the stories she played a central role. What's more, after iRobot appeared, and despite the fact that the book contained an epilogue briefly noting Dr. Calvin's death at an advanced age, I couldn't help bringing her back. I wrote 4 more stories dealing with her. In one of these, dear Susan appeared only glancingly. This was satisfaction guaranteed. And then it goes on to Little Lost Robots and Risk, Lenny, and he's talking about how Lenny got written while he was on vacation. So he took his typewriter on his vacation and worked a few hours every morning. And yeah, it just and he says his favorite Susan Calvin story is Galley Slave, and I like the story behind this one because Horace Gold, editor of Galaxy, H.L. Gold, called him up and says he wants a story. He needs a story, and Isaac says, well, he's knee deep in galleys of a biochemistry textbook that he's been co-written with other colleagues at the University of Boston. And he's saying he can't do it. But then he started thinking, well, no, Horace Gold says, well, can't you get somebody else to look at the galleys? So he started thinking about that, and why not a robot do it? And hence, Galley Slave was born. So he wrote it immediately. And he says that's his favorite Susan Calvin story. So yeah, so it's just a bit of a revisit to these two, because what we did was we read these. It's too difficult to get out of there. I read these in the Complete Robot, which doesn't have the editorial material, whether the fictitious journalist in iRobot or Isaac Asimov's interpolations, autobiographical and bibliographical information. And that's the thing, like every short story collection he did pretty well. I don't think I've seen them all, so I might be wrong with this, but I believe that every single one he did put extra little material in, which are little gemstones, to read about this. And there, one of my subscribers is doing a slow read through Before the Golden Age, which is a fabulous collection of 1930s science fiction, and it does have his autobiographical material in, and like he says, it shows how big of an ego he is. Well, if you really want to see how big of an ego he has, read his 2,000 plus page 3-volume autobiography. That'll give you sort of the details of his ego and other things, but they're very interesting, because I find not just his ego so much, because it's tinged with humor, but I find the bibliographical information very, very interesting, that is attached to the stories. So that's what I find interesting. But anyway, I'll leave it there. This went on longer than I expected, but iRobot Revisited and the rest of the robots. Take care, BookTube.